fallen from heaven, Lucifer, son of the morning. You shall be brought down to hell, to the depths of the pit, and all who gaze upon you will wonder, is this the man that made the nations tremble? The dark prince, when the devil has his day.
A hearty shalom to all of you. Jeffrey Seif here, pleased to welcome you again to Zola Levitt Presents. In this program, we're going to look at the pathetic and the prophetic. Not trying to gross you out by having you to visit garbage with me, but it's in the Bible as we look at a world gone bad. I won't leave you in the dumps, however. My good friend Paul Wilbur is going to lift us out of the malaise with some praise, but off we go to a world gone bad as we consider when the devil has his day.
The Devil's Workshop. Consider the work of his hands. And on her forehead was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, an abomination of the earth. And the woman sat upon a scarlet-colored beast, having 7 heads and 10 horns. She was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and decked with gold, having a cup in her hand full of abominations and fornications.
You may well have heard the expression, the glory that was Rome. Well, in this program, we want to look at the gory that was Rome. And by the way, you're seeing some of that glory behind me. This is a city that's been lifted up from the sands of time. Here in Bet Shean, we're in Israel proper, but behind me is a place that has Latin Rome written all over it. In fact, it was the pride of Rome up here in northern Israel back in its day. A day that goes back to Jesus' day, I might say. And so while at one level this is the glory of Rome represented here, when we open up the Bible today, we're looking at the gory of Rome. Because Rome didn't just bring with it structures, sticks and bricks. Rome brought with it values that flew in the face of biblical virtue. And here, in the Bible, in the 17th chapter of Revelation, John goes into that. And speaking of Revelation, let me remind, we're looking at a book that comes with villains and heroes. Heroes and heroines, by the way. On the heroine side of the fence, in the 12th chapter, there's a beautiful woman, a maiden, a Jewish woman who gives birth to the Messiah. And then the devil just unleashes on her. Actually, he was doing that before the Messiah was born, and certainly after. I can tell you that firsthand experience as a German Jew. There's a heroine there. In this case, in the 7th chapter, there's a villain, a villainous woman, described in the worst of terms. The more sensitive among us are going to be offended by what I'm about to share, but it's not my own word, and I'm not apologizing for delivering it. This woman is described in chapter 17, verse 5, as the mother of all harlots and the mother of the abominations of the earth. In fact, in chapter 17, verse 1 there, come, I'll show you the judgment on this great harlot, this great whore, this great slut. You might say, well, Jeffrey, I don't think you should use this language. Hey, listen, it's just language that describes the image. We're told in verse 2 that the kings of the earth commit fornication with her, and that the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. This woman has leverage over the species and beckons people to come her way, and apparently they come in droves. When we consider the day of the devil, when we want to look at his days and consider his ways, here's an image that emerges in the biblical text. Who was this woman, and who is she? And in terms of was, as in was this woman, what are we talking about here in the Bible? in terms of is, how does what we're talking about here manifest here? Not in the ancient world so much, but in the modern world that we live in. As we look at the devil in the last days and consider his ways, in this program particularly, we want to come to terms with this woman and see what we can learn from her and how it applies to the day and times in which we live.
The kings of the earth have fulfilled their wicked fantasies. The inhabitants of the earth are drunk with the wine of fornication. And the great whore of Babylon, arrayed in gold and precious stones, is now drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs.
Standing atop this Roman ruin and getting ready to descend down these steps, I'm reminded of the fact that when we enter the world of Revelation, we're entering into a world that's descending into an abyss, largely because of a Roman influence. Strange as that is to say, and the reason why I say that is because that's what's alluded to in the literature. In the first century, Rome was particularly well known for its debauchery. In fact, when Paul writes the book of Romans, at the very beginning, he gives voice to sexual impropriety, how people exchange natural relationships for those which are not natural. This observation was spurred along by the fact that the emperor, following the death of his second wife, took his male lover, castrated him, gave it his wife's name, and then married it, if you can imagine that publicly. This is a world gone wild. Of course, the Greeks were not known for the biblical virtues of propriety and sexual discretion, and this bled over to the Roman world that not only has its sexual licentiousness, but it's awash in revenue, the slave trade, various kinds of financial improprieties have brought all kinds of monies to the empire, and people are awash in all of that. Money, sex, licentiousness, it draws a lot of traffic, and John tells us that at day's end, this enterprise emerges the more so than it was even in the first century. And this reminds me frankly, and if I can speak frankly, it reminds me of the world that we live in today. Truth of the matter is that a man in an hour on the internet can see more naked women than Solomon saw in a lifetime, and he saw a lot. On TV too, I'm glad that you're watching. Really, I am. And as you well know, there are other viewing options. Goodness, you can just, with a flick of a wrist. And people are exposed to this multi-million, billion-dollar trade in licentiousness. It is so much the world that we live in. And it's interesting to note that at day's end, well, 2,000 years ago, when John is telescoping into the future, he gives voice to this emergent kind of debauchery that catches many in its web. What's interesting is that it's not only sexual impropriety. And I say that because if we look in chapter 18, we're told that in verse 11 that the merchants of the earth mourn. And why is that? In verse 14, because the fruit that their soul longs for has gone. And what are we talking about here in verse 15? The merchants of these things who became rich will stand and fear and weep and wail. And why is that? Because he describes the crash of a financial system. We're told in verse 17, for in 1 hour great riches came to nothing. Let me just say, odd as it is to say it, at one level, this is good news for the moment that we find ourselves in right now. And why do I say that? Because many worry, oh my God, is the world collapsing? The financial world is coming unglued. According to this testimony, after the rapture, into the tribulation period, where all of this is so very pronounced, the world is awash in revenue, and the ultimate collapse is to come later. And so Bible readers can come to terms with the fact that difficulties notwithstanding, we're not living at the apocalyptic end of our financial system as we know it.
And judgment was poured out upon the great whore of Babylon, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast. These shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall devour her, and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will. Her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Babylon the Great is fallen.
The world was ablaze as people's interior worlds were ablaze. The devil stokes the fire, and round about this bathhouse here were rooms where people could extinguish those fires. And what do I mean by that? This is a brothel, a house of ill repute. And there's a major bathhouse here in this major city. In Bible days, Old Testament names, Bethshan, in New Testament times, in Roman Latin times, Scythopolis. It was a major intersection here. Highways met and a city sprung up. And right off the main street of the city was a bathhouse with other rooms to attend to business here that's not worth talking about on Christian television. But there is something I want to talk about, and the reason why I want to talk about it is because the Bible does. The book Revelation is on record saying the whole world is ablaze at the ragged edge of human history. He goes on to talk about a whore, this is the imagery here, that catches the world by storm and draws people into her world through sorcery. We're told, for by her sorcery all the nations were deceived. In verse 23, people were drawn in. But that's the bad news. But there's good news in this story. And what's the good news? Well, the devil has his day, but you know what? We're told in Scripture that there's a judgment that's meted out, that the world, that this woman that has the world in her grasp is going to come to an inglorious end. In fact, in chapter 19 we're told, after these things I heard a loud voice, and a good voice I might add, of a great multitude in heaven saying, Hallelujah, salvation and glory and honor belong to our God. There's this heavenly anthem, this choir, this exaltation. And why is that? Now you're going to love this. And I'm glad to have a good story to tell in a bad story program. What is it you're going to love? There's a contrast here. And what do I mean by that? Well, after describing this woman in horrific terms, as I've alighted upon in this whole program, this woman is then judged. And this sets the stage for what the Bible calls the marriage supper of the Lamb. If you'll look with me in verse 7, let us be glad. Finally, I want to be glad. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. You know, a lot of people have gone bad in the world, but there are those that come out of that world. And they wash themselves in the blood of the Lamb, and they prepare for what the Bible calls the marriage supper of the Lamb. We're told in verse 8, and to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. It seems while there's a lot of bad activity going on, there are some people that make themselves right with God, and the net result is they prepare themselves for a glorious future, for a marriage feast. He goes on to say, then he said to me, right, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. There's a great offer on the table. There's an invitation. I don't know where you've come from in life. It could be with the laundry list of sins discussed in this program, you might feel guilty. I want you to know there's a way to get cleaned up, and there's an invitation to come to Jesus and make yourself ready for the marriage supper of the Lamb. Rabbi Paul, the apostle from Tarsus, said that we don't wrestle with flesh and blood. I'm here with my good friend Paul Wilbur, and if you've been following the series, you've been acquainted with him as well. But this is a wrestling match. We're tempted to be seduced into sin and despair and decay, aren't we?
Yeah, we really are. We're under attack in every way in our society. What we see, particularly what we hear, our children are under attack every day at school, at workplace. How do we counter that spirit of Babylon, that seducer that would say, come over here, I have floured and powdered my bedding and come through this door. The internet is an amazingly powerful, seductive spirit today.
Oh, goodness. Someone can see more naked women on the internet in a night than Solomon saw in a lifetime.
Sure.
It's all out there.
But I really believe that it was meant for our good. We can stream Zola Levitt programs through our internet. We can watch praise and worship from around the world, but we have the choice. So how do we counter the seduction of Babylon in our day? We have to make the good choice that, it's the old statement, junk in, junk out.
True.
And we have to really carefully guard our eye gates and our ear gates. We said on other programs, sometimes I'm challenged on a difficult day with driving, but if I'll put in praise and worship, if I'm putting in the Word of God, it's what comes out. I find myself being in a place that is much more available to the Spirit of God. And so how do we counter these seductive spirits? We want to take in the right teaching, sound doctrine, the love of God, especially through praise and worship, ministers to us body, soul, and spirit, and changes our whole experience.
Yes, and change is what it's all about. I look forward to the time when we shall all be changed. We're taught to pray, thy kingdom come, and there's a kingdom coming. And God will make all things new and all things good. And off we go now to hear from the late Zola Levitt as he talks about life on the other side with the kingdom to come.
The sheep and goats is done. The kingdom begins. The Lord dedicates the temple. The beginning of the kingdom is fascinating to me because Daniel gives a couple of numbers in his verses, Daniel 12, 11, and 12. How many days to here, how many days to there, and I calculated those. And if you'll watch that program, you'll see where I've concluded that the Lord holds the judgment of the sheep and goats about 30 days into the kingdom. And he holds the dedication of the temple 75 days into the kingdom, which is no ordinary day. It's the 25th day of Kislev, Hanukkah. On the Feast of Dedication, the Lord dedicates the millennial temple. Isn't that something? And we have a new ruling house on earth, a new place to live with our husband, the king. We're the bride of Christ now, but we'll be the queen of the kingdom to come, the wife of the king. Congratulations, you're engaged.
I look forward to the kingdom to come, like Zola, like you, but we got to live in this one, don't we, Paul? Mm-hmm. And it comes replete with many challenges, doesn't it?
It does. And one of the wonderful weapons against these challenges that God has given to us is the weapon of the warfare of our praise. We see it over and over and over through the scriptures, whether it's making a way through a sea where there's no parting, whether it's inviting the presence of God to overcome an armed and dangerous enemy, or it's simply taking us from a place of defeat to victory. The power of praise is so important for us today.
Yes, and for us to be a warrior and not a worrier. And Paul, you help us to do that so well. I just love your music, and I know you love him and his music too. Hey, thanks for loving us and staying with us. As you go now, Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Also, please call toll-free or write to receive our monthly newsletter, The Levitt Letter. It's absolutely free and contains insightful articles and news commentary with a refreshing perspective you won't get from mainstream media. The Levitt Letter is also available at levitt.com, along with current and archived TV programs, our national airing schedule, and much more. Please remember, Zola Levitt Ministries depends on tax-deductible donations from viewers like you. This has been a paid program brought to you by Zola Levitt Ministries.